Great, lovely to see you all today. I'm Deepa, I'm a locum GP from Hackney. I also work as a clinical lecturer at Queen Mary University, and I work part-time at Freedom from Torture writing medico-legal reports. Have any of you already seen this talk, The Heading for Extinction and What to Do About It? It's been developed by Extinction Rebellion. No, great.
A long time ago.
A long time, okay. So I saw it first being delivered in about February, March earlier this year, when I was starting to become a little bit more interested in Extinction Rebellion, and I think coming to see it for me really made me think a lot more about the issue, understand a little bit more about who Extinction Rebellion are, what they're trying to do and why they're trying to do this. And it's one of the reasons that I feel that I really want to be involved here today. I've not really ever thought about climate change all that much really until about a year ago. I studied a Master's in Public Health, and so started to learn a little bit about it then. And then I think watching the BBC4 documentary that David Attenborough did, seeing the youth climate strikes, and then going to things like this talk and learning a little bit more, got me a lot more interested. I've given it a few times to medical audiences, and it's been a really positive response, and I think I've been really appreciative of actually how much it's challenged people to think around it. So if any of you are interested in it today in giving the talk, please, it's available for people to give, and I'd encourage you to think about it. I guess this talk is kind of developed to talk about climate change from quite a basic level. Many of you may not already know quite a lot about it. Some of you not all that much, although it may feel like it's quite an important thing. So we're going to basically split the talk up into two bits. Normally I'd get you all to sort of sit and have a chat to your neighbours to discuss it a little bit more, but I think we'll do this a little bit later on in the talk. So the first bit is a bit of a review about the facts about climate change and its effects on health. And then also we're going to go on to thinking a bit about what we can do about this, who Extinction Rebellion are, what their approach is, and how they hope it's going to work. So for part one, many of you are already quite familiar about the changes and destruction that we're seeing in our climate and ecology. So here's a basic overview. For many of us, we need to consider that the Earth is our only life support system. There's no planet B really for us or for our future generations. Everything that we need on the Earth is contained on this planet really. In the air and in our biosphere, which is the land and the ocean ecosystems that support us. But we're in the process of destroying it. We're destroying our climates, we're destroying our ecology, and we're destroying our future. So for the last 12,000 years, we've enjoyed quite a balanced climate on the Earth, in which we get warming from the incoming sun that gets trapped by the greenhouse gases, and that acts as a kind of blanket, allowing our climate to be fairly temperate, and human beings as a result have colonized almost the entire planet. But since the Industrial Revolution, and especially over the last 50 years, we've been massively increasing the amount of fossil fuels that we have in our atmosphere, and that's mainly due to the burning of coal, oil and natural gas to help us build the very comfortable lives that we really enjoy now. But in this process we've been pumping out lots of carbon dioxide and methane into our atmosphere, and this has really intensified the greenhouse effect. So this isn't really, this may not be news to you, it wasn't really news to me, but what was news to me in this last year is the real extreme rate at which this has been happening. Some of you may have seen this graph here before, and what we can see is, for the past 2,000 years, the levels of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere have been very, very stable at about 280 parts per million. But since the Industrial Revolution started, those levels have started to skyrocket. And they've been increasing rapidly, really mainly in the last 50 years. And today they're at around 480 parts per million. And this is all, as I said, really happened in the last 50 years, so really in our watch. And this exponential rise in the greenhouse gases that we've got in our atmosphere is also paralleled by an exponential rise in planetary temperatures. Since the pre-industrial times, the temperatures on our planet Earth have been consistently above 1 degree what they were in pre-industrial times. So what does all of this really mean to us? Sometimes hard to kind of think around. But the IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it's a group of scientists and other experts who've been funded by the UN, and they were set up in 1988 to consider what was then the newly recognised greenhouse effect. In their latest reports, which was in 2018, they considered that anything above 1.5 degrees would have catastrophic consequences for the Earth, and in many cases irreversible effects on the planet and human societies. They recommended for carbon dioxide emissions to reach net zero by 2040 globally. Currently, those emissions are still increasing, as we just saw now. So the heads of the world's governments came together in 2015 to form what was the Paris Agreement, and that decided that they were going to keep global temperatures to just below 2 degrees, even though the IPCC recommended 1.5 degrees. We've got to also remember that the Paris Agreement isn't legally binding. When the US President Trump came to power, he withdrew the US from this government. So a 1 to 2 degrees temperature rise may not necessarily seem like very much or much to worry about. But you can see in the second graph that when you shift the whole temperature distribution over time, even if you shift it by just a small amount, there's a massive increase in the proportion of the curve that now lies under the hot zone. So this really translates into vast increases in places that have become almost unlivably hot. For example, Delhi, which saw temperatures of 50 degrees this summer, or areas that have been subject to extreme weather events, such as floods, hurricanes, or wildfires. So, because we've got a bit of a health audience here, I'm going to go into these in a little bit more detail. But the effects on health are really in 3 ways. Firstly, you've got the direct effects of weather systems. So things that we talked about, I mentioned, such as the increase in intensity of flooding, hurricanes, heat waves and wildfires. Secondly, you've got the effects mediated by natural systems. So things like changing disease vectors, reductions in crop yields leading to malnutrition that we've just been hearing about in the talk earlier. And finally, we've got effects mediated by social systems. So things like malnutrition, migration and refugee flows. So thinking about these in a bit more detail, looking at the direct effects of the weather, many parts of the Earth are still experiencing much more extreme weather events, which are happening a lot more frequently. So the first image here is of lots of cattle drowning underwater, and it was taken in Queensland in 2018, where they had a severe period of droughts followed by an intense period of severe rainfalls in which 500,000 cattle were killed. The next image here is of people queuing in the Indian city of Chennai, and they're queuing to collect water delivered to the city by water tankers because the water supply to the city almost dried out earlier this year. Down here we've got an image of the Californian wildfires last year in 2018. They were the deadliest and the most destructive wildfires in California on record. They had millions of hectares of land destroyed, 85 people were killed, and many had to leave their homes. The image that we have in the corner on the right here is of Cyclone Idai, which hit Mozambique in March 2019. It killed hundreds, left over 1 million people displaced from their homes, and it was followed a month later by Cyclone Kenneth. So these are some of the global effects, but locally we're also experiencing really intense effects of climate change. In 2004 we had a heat wave in Europe that killed over 70,000 people, including an estimated 2,000 people in the UK. Last summer was the hottest summer on record that we've seen in the UK. And earlier this year, the Welsh village of Fairborn, which is quite a low-lying village, decided that it had to decommission itself by 2025 because it could no longer protect itself from the rising sea levels. So then the second aspect was thinking about the effects that are mediated by natural systems. So thinking about disease vectors, it's predicted that the number of people that will be affected by malaria is going to increase by 200 million in the next few decades due to climate change. And those areas experiencing cholera, tick-borne disease, dengue are also going to increase substantially. One study has also predicted that due to climate change, there's going to be an 8 to 11% increase in the risk of diarrheal diseases in the tropics and subtropics. In addition, as we heard about earlier this morning from Rob, we're going to see even poorer air quality. And this is air pollution following forest fires, due to also an increased release of air allergens and increased levels of ozone. A new study that came out this year suggested that air pollution causes more deaths than smoking globally. And then moving on to the third and final bit of how health systems are going to be affected by climate change, which is through social systems. So we know that people living in hot countries, especially outdoor workers, are going to be most at risk of heat exhaustion and stroke, and therefore productivity in their working population will decrease with increased temperatures, and this is going to affect economies substantially. Also, as global temperatures increase, crop yields are going to decrease. Areas of regions that are too dry to support crop growing will increase, and we're going to see these adverse effects on food security, from production to quality to access and price in so many regions. Water shortages are going to become much more prevalent and serious, and droughts are going to be a real significant driver for population migration and conflict, especially in areas with more unstable economies and institutions. And especially in areas that we're going to be seeing an increasing competition for scarcer resources, and those with weaker institutions, we're going to see increased violence, increased conflict and war. The resulting health problems are going to impact on all of us. So if we assume that we continue our present trends of fossil fuel and population growth, this pathway outlined by the IPCC's most recent report has predicted that global average temperatures are going to reach more than 4 degrees above pre-industrial levels, with much higher average temperatures over land. And if we carry on this pathway by 2300, we're going to reach temperatures of 8 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures. At this level, one study has suggested that the Earth can only support a population of 1 billion people. And one of the really big problems, though, in making any of these predictions is that these effects of climate change are really hard to model accurately, because a lot of the models really take into account that we're going to be following a linear impact. But there's an increasing reason to think that actually this change in state isn't going to be linear, but much more of an accelerating effect due to certain amplifiers of climate change. One of these reasons is to do with the rapid rate of ice melt, especially in our poles. So the ice currently cools our Earth down considerably, partly by reflecting sunlight back into space, and also partly because as we melt the ice, we're going to replace them with more land and water. These are going to absorb even more heat from the sun and the atmosphere, and it's going to accelerate this negative feedback loop, melting the ice caps even faster. Our poles, in fact, are warming at a far more rapid rate than anywhere else on Earth. In the last few years, we've seen temperatures 30 degrees higher than what we'd expect in the Arctic during winter times. The other thing that the models haven't really taken into account, which is causing a lot of increasing concern, is that the melting of the permafrost, and the fact that this is going to release lots of methane. Methane is a greenhouse gas which is far more potent than carbon dioxide. If this was the case, then the acceleration of the rate of global warming would be much, much higher than what we're predicting now, making the curves that we are seeing even more steeper.
So the difficulty is that there's not just one feedback loop or two feedback loops, there's many. Some that we understand really well, others that we don't. Last year there was a paper published called The Hothouse Earth, which caused a lot of concern and shock. It proposed basically that these feedback loops can all influence each other, and once they reach a tipping point, they can trigger other feedbacks to kick in. This is called the Tipping Cascade. The authors predicted that if we reach this threshold, we could go down what they call the hothouse Earth pathway, in which our whole planet shifts through to a hotter climate and profoundly more different and diminished ecosystems. So as I mentioned before, these pathways and these tipping points are quite difficult to predict and therefore poorly represented in climate models. However, we do know that the chance of additional warming is going to get higher with every degree Celsius the global temperatures are going to go up. Right, so that was climate that we've talked about so far. Climate is only really part of the problem. We're also destroying the planet's ecology. So this is the land and the ocean ecosystems that support us. So one big problem for the Earth's ecology is the intense agriculture that's needed to support the Earth's current 7.5 billion human beings and their increasing desire for a high meat and dairy diet. We need to also remember, as we mentioned earlier, that the population is still increasing, and the UN have predicted that it will reach 10 billion by 2050. Much of the agriculture that we have produces meat, which consumes a lot more land to produce animal feed than crops do. The United Nations have estimated that 14.5% of human-caused carbon emissions come from livestock. Agriculture is using a lot of land that would otherwise be used for forests and natural grasslands, and also using a lot of water that would otherwise be sustaining river ecologies. All this activity is really damaging our ecosystems. We also need lots of pesticides for agriculture to keep it at the levels of production that we need, and also to prevent insects from destroying crops. However, pesticides have also caused catastrophic declines in the insect population worldwide. And it's predicted that this is going to lead to the extinction of 40% of the world's insect species over the next few decades. If we're going to lose pollinators such as bees and butterflies, lots of plants are then going to die out, including many that we rely on for our food sources. In also converting our forests to farmlands, we're losing an important carbon sink. There are carbon sinks because of the high growth of plant rates and the fact that these are retained in the soil once they die. In converting the forest to farmlands, we also lose a reservoir of biodiversity and one of the really important sources of pharmaceuticals that we have today. Forests are often cleared by burning, which causes both carbon emissions as well as particulate air pollution. And another problem is that although forests create quite moist microclimates that ensure sort of a continued sustained rainfall, farmlands are much drier and they need a lot more irrigating. The end process that we fear is desertification. So moving on to our oceans, they're also really important. They store a lot of the energy that we're accumulating due to the greenhouse effect. The effects of our oceans heating are several-fold. One is that hotter oceans hold a lot less oxygen, and this is really going to affect marine life. Secondly, ocean heating also mean that we're going to be disturbing the flow of ocean currents. Some scientists fear that this is going to trigger major changes in our climates. And as we mentioned earlier, a loss of the ice caps is also going to lead to a massive rise in sea levels worldwide, as well as lots of, a loss of many of our polar ice-living animal species. Measurements of global biodiversity are showing that we're really experiencing a dramatic decline in insect population as a result of our human activity, including the climate heating and the habitat destruction that we've just been discussing. In May 2019, a government body called the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the IPBES, produced a report suggesting that 1.5 million species are threatened with extinction. This rate of extinction has been estimated as being 100 times more than the background rate of extinction that we would expect. And this has led multiple scientists to conclude that we are entering a period of what is now known as the sixth mass extinction. So much of the collapse in the ecosystems that we're seeing has been taking place over the last 50 years as well. We're really stripping the planet of life, forever changing this world for our future generations, our children and our grandchildren. The problem is that as a society, we've been for a long time in denial of this ecological crisis. We've been watching it on television, we've been reading in the newspapers, we're informed citizens, we know that there's a problem with greenhouse gases and deforestation. We know intellectually all those things are happening, but at the same time we've kind of built a wall around ourselves, and we've built a wall around this knowledge and any action. And so this means that although we know about it, we're not doing anything about it. And really we need to do something about this. So the way to overcome this denial is to confront the realities of what's going on. That is really quite an emotional process at times. I guess at this moment here I wanted to just take a bit of a break. It's quite heavy hitting, even if you've known all about these facts and read about them before, to see them presented in a more condensed format. I'd like you to just take a minute and think for yourselves about how it makes you feel, and then maybe turn to a neighbour, speak to someone you haven't yet met before perhaps, and just take a few moments to reflect and discuss on how you've been feeling and where you want to go. We're going to look at the reasons why we need to act, why we can't just passively let things continue to unfold without kicking up a fuss. We've got a moral obligation to other things sharing our planet and also to our future generations. Looked at it like this question becomes not why should we fix this, but really how can we not? The Sustainable Development Goals are in this vein really, were adopted by the UN member states in 2015, and they provide a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for people and the planet. And to achieve this, they call for an urgent action to recognise that to stop the end of poverty and other deprivations, this needs to go hand in hand with not only improvements in education, for a reduction in inequalities, but also to tackle climate change and to fight to preserve our oceans and our forests. So in thinking about how do we do this, I often think it's a little bit easier to split it up into three levels. One is the personal, secondly is the organisational, and thirdly it's the political. So starting on the personal level, there's lots of different ways in which you can think about reducing your personal carbon emissions. You can go on online calculators to measure your carbon footprints and see the areas in which you can have an impact. Often lower impact methods include things like recycling, upgrading your light bulbs, starting to wash your clothes in cold water. At the higher end, the four most effective actions for an individual to take action are 1, to have fewer children, 2, to go car free, 3, to eat a plant-based diet, and 4, avoiding air travel. Thinking around it from more of an organisational level, as a health professional within the NHS, I hadn't realised that actually the NHS is quite a significant contributor of carbon emissions. In 2012, in the UK, the NHS emitted an alarming 40% of England's public sector carbon emissions. And many NHS trusts have been taking really big steps to improve their carbon footprints, and I think we're going to hear a bit later about that from James, looking at what Newcastle has been doing. And these steps have also had massive cost-saving implications, and also improved a lot of the patients' quality provision that they've been providing in their care. In the last decade, the NHS has managed to reduce its carbon footprint by about 20%. I'm a GP, so thinking about it from a GP perspective, there's a few things that have happened over the last few years. The RCGP has started up what they call the RCGP Green Impact Toolkit, which helps GP surgeries think around what their carbon footprint is and work through different stages at reducing it. And it gives practices a lot of support in doing this and allowing them to sort of build up bronze, silver and gold accreditation with increasing sort of levels of impact and complexity in how to achieve these things. Some other ideas that I found really interesting was a greener prescribing initiative. So my husband's family are from the Shetland Islands, and there lots of GPs have teamed up with the RSPB in thinking about prescribing green prescriptions, time outdoors and workshops instead of medications for lots of patients. And there's quite a good evidence base behind green prescriptions and in showing that actually they reduce rates of blood pressure, rates of anxiety and loneliness significantly. Other things that I hadn't really considered before this year was more about prescribing habits, and lots of work has been done on inhaler prescribing in the last few years, which I found really interesting. There's lots and lots of benefits of thinking about tackling climate change as well. That's going to have co-benefits on healthcare. We need to think lots more around this, and I think quite a few of the talks that we have this week are going to consider those aspects. So moving on to more of a political level. This quote is taken from the UN Climate Change Summit, which was earlier this year. It says, "The time has come for our leaders to show that they care about the people whose fate they hold in their hands. We need them to show that they care about the future and their present." And it was done in I guess it was said in the context of another quote that I'll give from them, is that preventing irreversible climate destruction is the race of our lives and for our lives. It's a race that we can and must win. So our government has recently declared a climate emergency. We must really hold them to account on this. And of course, thinking about this on a political level, lots of things have been tried to be done already. Since we became aware of the greenhouse effect and the problems that were starting to cause, governments have been assembling panels. There have been lots of treaties and summits on this issues. Locally, there have been lots of things that we've been trying through all the standard methods, such as political methods, legal, campaigning, marches, encouraging individual actions such as recycling. But really there's been very little interest politically. Politicians say that they support the Climate Change Act, but also in recent times they've been scrapping renewable energy schemes. They've voted for the expansion of Heathrow Airport. They've given the go-ahead to fracking in communities that have objected. And they've said that they're going to ban the sale of fossil fuel cars, but not until 2040. In 2018, the UK government's Climate Change Committee demonstrated that the UK is not on track to meet the 2 degrees Celsius climate targets that they set. There have been lots and lots of legal challenges to governments, and these have had little effect. Since 1990, more than 1,300 legal actions have been taken concerning climate action against governments in more than 28 countries. They haven't really been working. Traditional campaigns such as marches have also not worked. Encouragement to individual action has not been working either. It's almost even been counterproductive, as people feel that they're trying to do their bit, trying to recycle, and therefore they often have even greater difficulty in understanding that this is really barely a drop in the ocean of what we need to be doing. None of this has been working. As I showed on this graph before, you've seen the curve. Our rates of carbon emissions are drastically rising. Since the IPCC was formed, that hasn't really even made a dent in the skyrocketing emissions that we have today. So why aren't all these things working? And this is really built in to do with the structural problems that we're all locked into. For those of us who live in democracies, as we do here, voting comes around every few years. And this means that the governments can't really take a long view on what's happening. Governments are desperate for money, and therefore they often prioritise the needs for big businesses over the needs of the planet as a whole and over future generations. The final problem is that although every individual realises that each individual realises that their own individual efforts to curb emissions are really pointless unless everyone is also doing the same. And so if we're going to fix this problem, we really need to act together to do this. And this synchronous action really has to come from top down, because it's only really the authorities who have the leverage over an entire population through legal means to make this synchronous change happen. The strong academic consensus from the IPCC has predicted climate catastrophe without unprecedented change. As a medical doctor and health professional, the GMC, the General Medical Council, has stated that our code of conduct it compels us to act where we notice unacceptable risks to current and future patients' health, and to do this promptly. We've noted that the traditional methods of writing academic papers and journal articles haven't really produced sufficient results to continue with these alone. Therefore, we really need to take a different approach. We need to try something different. As the Swedish climate activist and Nobel Peace Prize nominee Greta Thunberg said, there are no rules for keeping fossil fuels in the ground, so we cannot win this by playing the rules. So instead, we really need to flout these rules and make new ones. Civil resistance, it's otherwise known as disobedience or nonviolent direct action, NVDA, which is Extinction Rebellion's preferred name, means that normally law-abiding citizens start to break the rules as a way to force change in a system that is refusing to change. It's been used successfully many times in the past, notably by Gandhi, who organised an Indian rebellion against British rule, by Rosa Parks, who famously refused to give up her seat to a white person on a bus and triggered the American Civil Rights Movement, and by Martin Luther King, who organised the movement and mobilised huge numbers of people to come together and fight racially discriminatory laws. Can people even see the PowerPoints? Yeah. So we should get it going again. Regarded as heroes now, but they were often vilified for their law-breaking behaviour and their disruptiveness. A recent BMJ editorial has called for health professionals to share the demands of school children and Extinction Rebellion activists, and to insist that all governments tell the truth about climate change, to declare an ecological emergency and a climate emergency, and to act urgently to halt biodiversity loss and to reduce greenhouse gases to net zero by or before 2030. So, what does this all mean, and what is civil resistance and non-violent direct action? Roger Hallam, who's one of the founders of Extinction Rebellion, says that this strategy of civil resistance needs to involve several key elements in order for chances of success to be maximised. So firstly, you have to stay really strictly non-violent. Indulging in violent and aggressive behaviour is going to exclude the vulnerable people, the elderly and children from being involved and from participating. You also need lots of people. You need thousands of people to be involved. You need to go to the capital city, because this is where the rich and the powerful are. This is where the government, the big businesses and the media are. You need to break the law. You need to sit on the road or glue yourself to an entrance or a building or such like. And this is what really gets the attention, unlike A to B marches. And crucially, this has to go on day after day. Like a labour strike, you have to impose economic and reputational damage on your opponents over a really extended period of time. And finally, it has to be really fun, because celebratory cultural spaces are far more welcoming and inviting than very much more narrowly political ones are. So, Extinction Rebellion. So it's grown exponentially. It was officially launched in October 2018, and since then it's grown global. It's set up in more than 50 countries, with well over 200 local groups. This is the last count a few months ago. I'm not sure, yeah, I can imagine that's increased by a lot today as well. We've had hundreds and thousands of actions in the UK and worldwide, which have included Rebellion Day in November, where we closed down 5 London bridges, the April Rebellion, where central London was blockaded for 10 days, and this got widespread national media coverage and social media coverage. There have also been many hundreds of local protests, including the Summer Rebellion in 5 cities across the UK, die-ins in which protesters lie on the ground in a public space to symbolise the deaths and the destruction to come if we don't act. Also street parties, banner hangings, funeral processions. There's been endless creativity. So what do we demand? Extinction Rebellion demand three things. The first is for the government and the media to tell the truth about climate change and the ecological crisis, to stop whitewashing the news, to stop playing down the dangers and playing up the steps that have already been taken, and to stop generally misleading the public about what is going on. The second demand is for carbon emissions to be reduced to net zero by 2030. And the third demand is for a citizens' assembly to be convened to oversee these changes. I'm going to look at this last one in a little bit more detail. So, a citizens' assembly. This quote was taken from the UK parliamentary website. It says, "A citizens' assembly is a group of people who are brought together to discuss an issue or issues and reach conclusion about what they think should happen. The people who take part are chosen so that they reflect the wider population in terms of demographic, so age, gender, ethnicity, social class, and something relevant, and sometimes other relevant attitudes." So, effectively, it's basically formed by a group of people who've been selected by a process of sortition on the basis of their demographics to make sure that they're representative of the general population. So the nature of the representation really depends on the issue, but something like climate change is really, really wide. Anything and everything that you could think of that could be relevant, like a few of the things that we mentioned earlier. So these people then gather together, they hear the evidence from experts and stakeholders. They also hear from the public, because the public has the chance to feed in their opinions as well. They get together, they discuss what they've just heard, and think about what should be done. They make a formal document, and they present this to the government. The government then reviews this and implements this. So, thinking a little bit more about why this, as opposed to other methods, could be successful. So this process isn't dependent on voter goodwill, which means that it can really take the long view, making changes that are unpopular in the short term, but really good for us in the long term. Similarly, they're also free of corporate influences that often skew government decision-making, which needs to keep powerful corporations in power so that governments can stay in power. And because citizens' assemblies are often perceived as being fairer, they're often trusted a lot more by the public, and even if their recommendations are painful, they're often a lot more accepted. This form of government has been quite effective in some other situations. For example, Ireland called a citizens' assembly to discuss the really difficult issue of abortion. Here the recommendation was made that they should legalise abortion, and this was put to a vote in a referendum. In the referendum, the vote that came out was pretty much identical to what the Citizens' Assembly had recommended. So moving on to thinking a bit more practically about how Extinction Rebellion works. So for the most important thing really for our success, as I mentioned earlier, is that we're non-violent. This is for the moral reason that one ought to do harm, but also for the practical reason that non-violence is a lot more effective. The moment an organisation becomes violent, the authorities can invoke additional powers to suppress it and to curb its activities. This quote from John Lennon I'll just read out. "When it gets down to using violence, then you're playing the system's game. Because once they got you violent, then they know how to handle you. The only thing they don't know how to handle is non-violence and humour." Okay, so secondly, it's a decentralised process. It's non-hierarchical. And that's, I guess, up to a point, because there is a kind of a central loose body that does coordinate things. But the decentralisation is really important because it means that decisions can be made locally and quite quickly without the need for ponderous bureaucracy. It means everyone has a similar amount of power and say in what goes on. So the organisation is made of multiple groups. Some of these are local, for example, within a town or a borough or a county level. Others are national, dealing with a specific issue, such as media and messaging, legal observing, or Doctors for Extinction Rebellion is another example. So when actions are executed, people come together in what we call affinity groups, which are small groups of people that buddy up and support each other in the actions. So there are many activities that go on with Extinction Rebellion, but the fundamental aspect of what we do are actions. these are disruptive protests that aim to really poke a stick in the whole business as usual, in the wheels of business as usual, and also to get the authorities and the populace to take notice of what we're saying. So some actions are quite local. So, for example, this is an image of the first social that we had for the North East London Doctors for Extinction Rebellion group. Some of these are images from the summer uprising that was held earlier this year in Hackney, where we had road blockades. There was a critical mass cycle ride, and we had lots of tents in the local park, including a family tent with lots of craft activities going on. Other activities are more national. So starting April the 15th, groups from all over the country converged in central London and took over some key sites. There were 4 key sites that they took over. There was Waterloo Bridge, where there's a bandstand and they planted trees. Oxford Circus, where the famous big pink boat was installed. Also Marble Arch and Parliament Square. Following this, the government declared the climate emergency, and this is part of our first demand. This was on May the 1st. Many of you may have seen last week on Wednesday, Doctors for Extinction Rebellion held an action in which 4 doctors were arrested. There's been lots going on. And this is us here today. We're all part of the October Rebellion. Get all your friends and family and colleagues to come and join us. So yeah, people getting arrested, I guess, is really the most visible and noteworthy aspect of Extinction Rebellion, and it's really central to how we work, because it really makes the point that we're serious about this issue, so much so that people are willing to give up their liberty to make their voices heard. So yeah, on this picture we've got 2 retired GPs who were arrested amongst thousands of others in the April Rebellion. But that said, there are lots and lots of other roles for people to take on. Many people are in a position, I guess like myself, where I feel that I don't want to get arrested. And really, and I guess only a small proportion of people necessarily need to get arrested. There are lots of supportive roles that people can take on. For example, protesting but being asked to move, but moving on when the police ask you to move on. Great. Taking part in well-being, looking after the arrestees, making artwork, giving talks like this one to the general public. So there are lots and lots and lots of reasons why you might want to get involved. Firstly, we're the only game in town. Secondly, inaction is morally indefensible. Thirdly, positive action is really therapeutic and also a lot of fun. Fourthly, it's a chance to meet lots of people who are doing great work and make you feel that you're doing something worthwhile. But really, the one that I just can't get out of my head is that it means that you're on the right side of history, and I guess that's why I constantly have running at the back of my head, and that's why so many of us, I'm sure, are here today. This quote by Margaret Mead, an anthropologist, is also something that I wanted to leave you with. It says, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed people can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." So, in summary, as many of you already here have come to that conclusion, but I hope you'll spread the message and speak to lots of others about it. You don't need permission from anyone to get involved. There's links to the Extinction Rebellion website, our Doctors for Extinction Rebellion group. And if any of you are interested in getting involved, please speak to many of us here today and find out a little bit more.